Establishing one key point first, a high-ranking government authority once publicly described Jeffrey Epstein as the most effective blackmailer in
and
history.
said, look, you got to
Let us then
prosecute this
establish a
case.
second. The
And I
Department
looked
of
at it.
Justice has not formally questioned this
And
official
either
about
I
that
didn't
specific
believe
assertion.
that the
Moving
defendant
to
was
a
guilty,
third established
or
fact, this very
I
admission
didn't
was
believe I could
verified
prove
under
it
direct
beyond a reasonable
interrogation
doubt.
during a Senate hearing by Attorney
Or
General
I
Pam
thought
Bondi.
it was not.
The president,
Therefore,
and
the
I am
single
not going to
significant
have it.
query
I'm not
remaining
going to
is
put up
what
with it.
exactly this
And
structure
none
is
of
doing
them,
when a
none of
proclamation
them
of such
asked
magnitude
America-
exists,
Have to believe,
yet nobody appears
do you
urgent
not, that
about
the
testing it
prosecution
while
is in the
under oath.
public interest?
Nothing
Is that
regarding the
correct?
hearing's first few minutes initially signaled what it would ultimately become.
Now,
Senators delivered
if one of
opening
your
remarks
superiors
with
came to
measured
you,
tones while staffers moved
well,
about
let me answer
quietly
the
behind
question
them.
for you for how I would
The
do
general
it.
rhythm
If one of my
adhered to a pattern
superiors
which
Excuse me,
anyone
I'm
familiar
gonna
with
answer the
Capitol Hill
question.
operations
my
could
question.
No,
recognize.
I'm going to answer the question.
Questions
the way
and
I
answers
want to
were
answer the
framed in
question. Your
standard
reactions are
procedural
ridiculous.
language, demonstrating the persistent hum of institutional control. Although cameras captured every moment, nothing appearing in those early minutes carried a sense of urgency. Then that specific name entered the legislative chamber. John Kennedy did not need to raise his voice or alter his measured delivery. He merely shifted the entire topic of discussion to Jeffrey Epstein. In doing so, he redirected the dynamic and gravity of the entire proceeding. This was not because Epstein is new to public discourse, nor because the allegations are unfamiliar. Rather, it was because the specific question he posed forced everyone present to confront something still unresolved. It touched upon something persistent, something that flatly refuses to remain buried beneath previous document releases and various official summaries. Kennedy explicitly referenced an interview that was given by Howard Lutnick. During that conversation, Lutnick did not depict Epstein as merely being wealthy, well-connected, or a criminal actor. He instead characterized him as strategic and highly calculated, a man whose entire operation might have been constructed not simply on exploitation, but on leverage, on recording, and on total control. Subsequently, Kennedy performed a very simple action. He inquired whether Pam Bondi had personally reviewed the transcript of that specific interview. Her response to him was equally straightforward. She indicated that she had indeed viewed a short clip but had not reviewed the complete written transcript. This is precisely the instance when the nature of the hearing fundamentally shifted. In any other situation, such an answer might be considered acceptable. In any routine legal matter, perhaps partial awareness of the facts would be sufficient to proceed with caution. However, this matter is absolutely not just any ordinary case. This particular case has extended across multiple presidential administrations, initiated major international investigations, generated thousands upon thousands of pages of documents, and left behind a long trail of unanswered questions that seem to defy final resolution. Consequently, when the Attorney General of the United States acknowledges awareness of a public claim that Epstein may have actually operated as a large-scale blackmailer and yet has not fully reviewed it, the issue ceases to be merely procedural. The situation becomes entirely structural. Kennedy did not allow that specific moment to pass without comment. He immediately expanded the context. He reminded everyone present in the room that Lutnick was not speaking on the subject from a distance. According to that very interview, Lutnick had lived immediately next door to Epstein, meaning their high-end townhomes literally shared a physical wall. This was not mere speculation being offered by a commentator. This was evidence of direct physical proximity. Subsequently, Kennedy introduced the significant implication. If Epstein's operating method involved inviting influential, powerful individuals into private spaces specifically under highly controlled conditions, and if those specific interactions were being recorded, then Epstein's true power was not merely financial, it was ultimately transformational. It was direct leverage. Kennedy chose not to embellish that specific point. He merely repeated what had already been stated very clearly and publicly. He explicitly described the scenario exactly as it had been originally presented. Private rooms, deeply influential men, the distinct suggestion of active recordings, and the possibility that what transpired inside those confined rooms did not actually stay there. Then followed the question that perhaps should have been entirely routine. Had the Department of Justice interviewed Howard Lutnick directly about these substantial claims? Pam Bondi answered with only one word: No. No elaboration was offered, no immediate follow-up was suggested from the department's side, and there was absolutely no indication that such a crucial interview was even pending. Therefore, Kennedy asked her a second time, but this time shifting the focus specifically to intent. Would the Department of Justice be creating a plan to interview Lutnick? It is here that the nature of the language used shifted dramatically. Bondi did not definitively say yes, nor did she say no. Instead, she stated that if Lutnick wanted to speak with the FBI, or conversely, if the FBI wanted to speak with him, that conversation could occur. On paper, perhaps that answer is intentionally cautious, as it respects the established legal process, avoids any overcommitment, and arguably protects the integrity of any potential investigations. However, in practice, that specific answer introduces a completely different, substantive problem entirely. This is because the Department of Justice cannot be considered a passive observer in criminal cases possessing this magnitude. It does not typically wait around for potential witnesses to simply volunteer themselves when the central allegations involve widespread blackmail networks tied directly to one of the most infamous and significant criminal figures in all of modern history. So, what exactly is transpiring here? Let us adopt a more prosecutorial mode. If a specific public statement directly suggests that Epstein's entire operation essentially involved blackmail, that statement cannot be dismissed as background noise. It is instead a direct lead. In any standard functioning investigative framework, leads are rigorously tested, they are corroborated, challenged, documented, and eventually either validated or dismissed through direct personal engagement. That means interviews, it means written transcripts, it means follow-up questioning conducted under conditions that ensure accountability. However, what we all witnessed in this hearing strongly suggests a different approach. We observed official acknowledgement without any subsequent escalation and awareness without any resulting action. That is precisely where a significant internal contradiction begins to take form. For the Department of Justice has repeatedly and publicly stated that it has relentlessly pursued the Epstein case across multiple presidential administrations. It has released various documents, issued official memos, and maintained a position that it has not uncovered reliable evidence supporting some of the more expansive, overarching claims surrounding Epstein's supposed network. Yet now we have a senior official publicly characterizing Epstein using terms that very directly imply a significantly broader operational model, one that would by definition involve other individuals, other prominent actors, and potentially other serious crimes. Thus, either that specific public claim has been previously tested and subsequently dismissed, or it simply has not been fully examined at all. And if it has not yet been fully examined, then the ultimate question is not whether the department has already reached conclusions. The question is whether it has actually reached those conclusions prematurely. Kennedy clearly grasped that inherent tension. Instead of continuing to push further on the subject of Epstein directly, he then shifted the dynamic of the conversation in a particular way that revealed something arguably even more consequential. He introduced a specific hypothetical scenario, at least that is how the context was initially framed. He explicitly asked Bondi to imagine a situation where criminal investigators were seeking phone records from a major telecommunications company. This is not unusual during criminal investigations. Subpoenas are legally issued, the records are formally requested, and the private companies subsequently comply. But then Kennedy intentionally added a single critical variable. What if the target of those sought records was not merely an ordinary American citizen? What if the individual was instead a sitting United States senator? The room did not react immediately to this hypothetical, but the legal implication was already crystal clear. For obtaining the detailed phone records of a sitting senator is not by any measure a routine investigative act. It requires a level of detailed justification that goes significantly beyond standard investigative thresholds, and it raises profound questions about the constitutional separation of powers, about privacy rights, and about the delicate balance between necessary law enforcement authority and established constitutional protections. Kennedy then proceeded to walk through the entire process step by step. A subpoena would typically need to be issued. A federal judge would usually need to sign off on the request. The telecommunications companies, guided heavily by their general counsel, would carefully evaluate any legal risk. If that legal risk was deemed significant, they would possess the clear option to legally challenge the subpoena by filing a formal motion to quash the request. Bondi, during questioning, confirmed these general principles. Yes, companies do possess the ability to legally challenge these subpoenas. Yes, they heavily consider potential civil liability. And yes, they operate under defined legal frameworks that allow them to push back when appropriate. Consequently, Kennedy pushed her further on the subject. If a telecommunications company received a formal request for the phone records belonging to a sitting senator, and if that same company deliberately chose not to challenge that subpoena, then that company would absolutely need a very strong legal basis for its compliance because the only alternative is massive exposure to civil liability. Again, Bondi agreed with him in principle. It was then that Kennedy introduced the crucial detail that fundamentally altered the entire meaning and gravity of the hypothetical. He explicitly referenced the specific possibility that this had in fact already occurred. Namely, that federal investigators had previously obtained phone records connected directly to multiple sitting senators. Not just one senator, but eight sitting United States senators. At that precise juncture, the hypothetical was no longer hypothetical in nature. It was instead a deliberate frame, a structure specifically designed to test what Bondi would be willing to acknowledge and, conversely, what she would flatly refuse to confirm. Kennedy asked her whether she had personal copies of those specific subpoena applications. She declined to provide an answer. He then asked whether she could merely confirm the existence of those specific records. Again, she declined. He then asked when she would ultimately be able to discuss the matter. Once again, the final answer returned to the exact same established boundary. She stated that she could not discuss whether or not there was an ongoing investigation. This is exactly where the second critical layer of this hearing reveals itself. We are now no longer dealing with the Epstein case as an entirely isolated or contained matter. We are instead dealing with the distinct possibility that significant investigative tools, subpoenas, detailed data requests, and cooperation with private companies have been utilized in ways that directly touch the very highest levels of our government. Furthermore, when those powerful tools intersect with elected officials, the stakes dramatically change. The necessary legal standards must become stricter, the scrutiny becomes sharper, and the overall consequences become broader. So let us stack the available evidence. We have a distinct public claim that Epstein may have actually operated as a large-scale blackmailer. We have explicit acknowledgement of that very claim at the absolute highest level of the Department of Justice. We have zero confirmation that any direct investigative follow-up was ever conducted with the source of that claim. We have a hypothetical scenario that strongly suggests the collection of phone records tied directly to multiple sitting United States senators. We have a flat refusal to either confirm or deny the existence of those specific records. Each of these unique elements can be theoretically explained in isolation. Together, however, they form a clear and undeniable pattern. It is a pattern of highly controlled disclosure of specific information that exists entirely within the system, but does not fully exit it. It is a pattern of answers that remain technically and legally accurate while intentionally leaving the central question entirely unresolved. This pattern inevitably leads directly to a deeper, more profound issue: trust. Trust is not built on what a complex system says when it is completely comfortable. It is built instead on what that same system is actually willing to confront when the available facts become inconvenient, when the ultimate implications extend beyond any single individual, and when the required answers begin to touch the very people who sit inside the very structure that is asking the questions. This is exactly the moment where this entire hearing begins to fracture. Because if you choose to follow the logic step by step, not through emotion but strictly procedurally, you arrive at a point that simply cannot be ignored. If a private telecommunications company receives a legal subpoena for the private phone records of a sitting United States senator, that company possesses only two choices. They must either comply or challenge. If they choose to comply, they must be absolutely certain that the legal justification behind the request is completely airtight, because the resulting exposure to civil liability is enormous. Conversely, if they choose to challenge the request, they automatically trigger judicial review, thereby forcing a court to examine whether the request meets the necessary legal threshold for compliance. Now, here is the critical pressure point. According to the structural framework as laid out by Senator John Kennedy, these telecommunications companies did not choose to challenge the requests, they chose to comply. If that is true, if 8 sitting United States senators had their private phone records accessed without those subpoenas being contested by the companies, then the question is no longer a hypothetical one. Instead, it becomes a question of fundamental judgment. Who exactly made the official call that this extreme level of intrusion was legally justified? Who reviewed the required probable cause? Who officially signed off on it, not just in a narrow legal sense, but institutionally? And more importantly, who else was officially informed? Kennedy sharpened that specific question with precision. He asked Pam Bondi whether in a serious situation like this, a special counsel would be reasonably expected to inform the Attorney General of the United States prior to pursuing records tied directly to sitting senators. This is not some trivial detail. In the hierarchy of federal law enforcement, certain distinct actions carry weight that extends far beyond their immediate investigative value. These actions carry significant institutional consequences, they carry political consequences, and they carry profound constitutional consequences. Requesting the phone records of elected officials clearly falls into that elevated category. Bondi's answer did not directly resolve the issue, but Kennedy immediately reframed it. If you were the special counsel, would you personally inform the Attorney General? If you were the director of the FBI, would you reasonably expect to be told this information? These are not trivial questions about paperwork. They are questions about ultimate accountability. Because if the true answer is yes, and it almost certainly is, then any failure to inform that higher office raises another, different layer of profound concern. Was this particular operation conducted with full transparency inside the Department of Justice? Or conversely, were critical decisions made at internal levels that intentionally bypassed the standard chain of oversight? This is exactly where the hearing ceases being about Epstein and instead starts being about the entire architecture of power itself. This is because the same vast system that claims it has aggressively pursued Epstein across multiple administrations is now being rigorously examined for how it handles investigations that may actually implicate its own members, its own high officials, and its own unique institutional ecosystem. In that precise moment, every careful, procedural answer begins to sound entirely different. I cannot discuss that. I cannot confirm the details. I cannot comment on an ongoing investigation. Individually, these are entirely standard law enforcement responses. Together, however, they form a powerful shield, a shield that protects not merely sensitive information, but the very boundaries of what the American public is allowed to understand. Let us now bring this entirely back to the original public claim. Howard Lutnick described Jeffrey Epstein as the greatest blackmailer in history, not as a trafficker alone and not just as an abuser, but specifically as a blackmailer. That single word, blackmailer, changes everything. Because blackmail, by definition, implies leverage. Leverage implies targets. Targets imply vulnerability. Vulnerability existing at that elevated level does not stay isolated. If Epstein built a system based upon collecting compromising material on powerful people, then the logical next question becomes unavoidable. Where exactly did that material go? Was it destroyed? Was it seized? Was it officially cataloged as evidence? Or conversely, does it still exist somewhere, perhaps embedded in files, in archives, or in digital systems that the public does not see? And if it does indeed still exist, then who has direct access to it? This is not mere speculation for the sake of causing drama. This is instead the natural, logical extension of the public claim that was deliberately introduced into this Senate hearing itself. And yet, when given the clear opportunity to engage with that claim directly, the Department of Justice did not choose to escalate. They chose instead to defer that decision. Whether that decision was intentional or purely procedural, it carries immense weight. Because in high-profile cases, public perception becomes part of the ultimate evidence. Not strictly legal evidence, but public evidence. The public has been watching this entire case unfold for years. They have watched countless documents be released in large batches, each single release being framed as a major step toward transparency. They have watched redactions continue to obscure key details, with names consistently withheld, specific sections blacked out, and necessary context removed. They have watched officials state repeatedly that investigations have not uncovered evidence supporting broader conspiracies. And yet the fundamental questions persist, not because the people are unwilling to accept answers, but because the answers being provided consistently feel incomplete. That profound incompleteness is not some abstract concept. It has real consequences. Behind every single document, behind every single sealed file, and behind every cautious response, there are individuals whose lives were directly affected by Epstein's actions. Victims, people who were exploited, manipulated, trafficked, and left to navigate the aftermath of a system that at times fundamentally failed to protect them. For those individuals, this is absolutely not a theoretical debate about legal procedure. It is instead a question of whether the full truth has truly been pursued with the urgency that it deserves. When they hear that a potential lead, one that strongly suggests a significantly broader network of leverage and control, has not been aggressively investigated, it merely reinforces a perception that has been building for years. The perception that some questions are
You
pursued
have to go through a
relentlessly
committee, do
and
you
other
not?
questions
That's
are
correct.
handled carefully, too carefully.
Now,
Now, layer on top of that situation
one
the
of my
second issue
colleagues,
that
not
was raised
Senator
during the
Welch,
hearing, the possibility that federal investigators access the
suggested
phone records of multiple sitting United States
that
senators.
you live
If that happened without any legal
in the
challenge,
left.
without
Colonel
transparency, and without any
The
clear
Dow,
public explanation,
the Dow right
then the
now
public is
over,
left attempting to reconcile
the Dow
two
is over
distinct and competing
50,000
Not in the
realities.
public
On one
interest,
hand, a justice
because it
system
would
that firmly
undermine
asserts it follows the
the
law,
integrity
respects
of
due
the
process,
criminal
and
justice
operates
system.
within clearly defined boundaries.
I would resign.
On the other hand, a scenario where those boundaries
You would
appear to
because
be
gave
flexible
me, but I
when
will answer the
circumstances
question
demand
to
it.
the best of my ability.
That internal
As I
tension
said,
is not easy
we
to
will
resolve.
look and investigate
This is
any
because the
case
same
involving
powerful tools that allow law enforcement to investigate crime, subpoenas, data requests, surveillance, are also the exact same tools that can be misused if not properly constrained by oversight. When those tools intersect with political power, the margin for error becomes much smaller. So the question becomes entirely unavoidable. Is the system applying its established standards consistently, or is it adjusting those standards depending on who exactly is involved? Kennedy did not answer that question. He did not need to. He constructed the question, laid out the entire framework step by step, and simply allowed the implications to speak for themselves. That is why the hearing resonated so deeply, not because it provided final answers, but because it exposed the massive gaps between what is known, what is officially said, and what is still withheld. Let us go one layer deeper. If telecommunications companies indeed complied with subpoenas for sensitive records without challenging them, then their general counsels made a deliberate decision. A decision that weighed perceived legal risk against compliance. Kennedy pointed that out with a level of bluntness that cut straight through the procedural language. If they did not challenge, they better have a damn good reason, because otherwise they are exposed. Exposed to massive lawsuits, exposed to intense public scrutiny, and exposed to the fundamental question of whether they fulfilled their primary duty to protect user data. And if multiple large companies were involved, that exposure only multiplies. Now add in another critical variable. What if those telecommunications companies had a good reason? What if they were legally forbidden from telling the target under the theory that it might compromise an active investigation? Under that specific scenario, they would not be permitted to tip off the target of the investigation. They would not be able to warn a sitting senator that their records were being requested. So now the system is operating in a specific space where secrecy is not just permitted, but it is actually legally required. That creates a profound paradox. The same secrecy that is designed to protect the integrity of an investigation also prevents the public from truly understanding how that investigation is being conducted in their name. So again, we must return to the issue of trust. Trust in the process, trust in the institutions, and trust that the law is being applied evenly, regardless of status, position, or power. However, trust is not sustained by silence, it is sustained by clarity. And clarity is exactly what this particular hearing struggled to provide. Clarity requires significantly more than just carefully worded answers. It requires a willingness to follow the internal logic all the way to its conclusion, even when that conclusion becomes uncomfortable, even when it forces the entire system to look inward instead of outward. This is precisely the point where this entire hearing hesitates, because if we continue stacking the established facts, not speculating, not dramatizing, but just following the clear internal logic, then the picture becomes sharper, not blurrier. Start again with the first thread. A senior official, Howard Lutnick, publicly states that Jeffrey Epstein may have operated as the greatest blackmailer in history. That statement implies an entire system, not an isolated crime, but a structure intentionally built on leverage. Now move to the second thread. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, acknowledges clear awareness of that statement, yet confirms no full review of the transcript and no direct interview with the individual who actually made it. Now add the third thread, a direct line of questioning that strongly suggests federal investigators may have accessed phone records tied to 8 sitting United States senators, with no confirmation of whether those subpoenas were challenged or how the internal oversight process functioned. Individually, each single thread raises legitimate concern. Together, however, they begin to significantly overlap. For if Epstein's alleged method involved gathering compromising information on powerful individuals, and if federal investigators later pursued sensitive communication records tied to elected officials, then the potential intersection between those two realities becomes impossible to ignore. This is not because they are definitively and proven to be connected, but because the system has not clearly demonstrated that they are not. And that distinction profoundly matters. In law, the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, but in public trust, the absence of clarity becomes something else entirely. It becomes suspicion. Now watch how the system responds to that mounting pressure. When Kennedy raises the possibility of massive liability for telecommunications companies, he is not just discussing corporate risk, he is testing whether the system acknowledges that decisions were made. Real decisions, possessing real legal consequences, with massive potential exposure. Bondi responds completely within the bounds of standard procedure. She confirms general legal principles, and she avoids specifics. Again, that is legally sound. But let us examine the glaring internal contradiction. If the Department of Justice is truly confident in its overall handling of the Epstein case, and if it has followed all leads, examined evidence, and reached conclusions based upon thorough investigation, then why does a public claim of blackmail at that scale not trigger immediate visible follow-up? Why is the response to that lead entirely conditional? If he wants to talk, if the FBI wants to talk, that is not the language of pursuit. That is merely the language of possibility. And in a case defined by unanswered questions, possibility is not nearly enough. Now layer in the second significant contradiction. If investigators possess sufficient legal basis to obtain phone records tied directly to sitting senators, then that legal basis must have been substantial. Probable cause, judicial approval, and rigorous internal review. That level of action does not happen casually. It does not happen without documentation, and it absolutely does not happen without awareness at multiple levels of the system. So when Kennedy asks whether the Attorney General knew, whether the FBI director knew, and whether the entire chain of command was officially informed, he is not fishing for petty details. He is mapping ultimate accountability. For in any system that claims legitimacy, actions possessing that magnitude cannot exist in isolation. They must be anchored, authorized, and reviewed. And if they are not, then the issue is no longer about one single investigation. It is instead about governance itself. Now consider the prolonged silence that follows those critical questions. Not a loud silence, not a dramatic silence, but a controlled silence, the kind that is built into the language itself. I cannot discuss that. I cannot confirm that. I cannot comment on that. Each statement effectively closes a door. Each statement protects a defined boundary, but taken together they create a narrow corridor with no visible exit. That is where the public begins to lose its footing. Because without visibility, without confirmation, and without clear answers, the only thing left for people is interpretation. And interpretation in a case like this instantly fills itself with doubt. Let us now move into the moral frame of this situation. This is the exact point where legal procedure meets human consequence. Behind every legal argument, behind every subpoena, and behind every withheld detail, there are people who were directly affected by Epstein's operation. Individuals who were recruited, manipulated, and exploited. Individuals who have spent years watching this case unfold, hoping for resolution, hoping for clarity, and hoping for acknowledgement that what happened to them has been fully confronted by the system responsible for delivering justice. Now, place yourself in that position. You hear a senior official describe Epstein not just as a criminal, but as a blackmailer operating at a scale that implies influence over powerful individuals. You hear that this specific claim has not been aggressively pursued, at least not in any way that is visible to the public. What does that tell you? Does it tell you that the system has already thoroughly investigated and simply found nothing? Or does it tell you that certain paths are being approached more cautiously than others? Because from the outside, those two scenarios can look identical. And that ambiguity is where trust erodes. Now return to the overall structure of the hearing. Kennedy does something that is often overlooked. He transitions from Epstein to process. At first glance, this feels like a shift, a move away from one topic and over to another. In reality, it is a convergence. By introducing the issue of phone records, subpoenas, and telecommunications companies, he is expanding the entire frame. He is no longer asking merely what happened in the Epstein case. He is instead asking, how does this system behave when the stakes involve powerful people? That is a completely different question, and it is a much more dangerous one. This is because it does not stop at one specific case. It applies everywhere. If the system is consistent, then the rules are clear. If the system is flexible, then the rules depend entirely on context. And if the rules depend on context, then the question becomes unavoidable. Whose context matters most? Now look at the response pattern again. Bondi does not contradict Kennedy. She does not reject the legal framework that he outlines. She agrees with the principles. Companies can challenge subpoenas, general counsels assess risk, and liability exists. Everything at the level of theory is perfectly intact. However, theory is not the true issue, execution is. This is because the gap between what the system says it does and what it actually does is where credibility is tested, and this hearing lives entirely inside that gap. Now consider one more layer. Kennedy raises the possibility that if companies did not challenge those subpoenas, they must have believed the legal justification behind them was strong enough to withstand scrutiny. That belief did not merely appear out of nowhere. It would have been based upon direct representations made by investigators on the specific framing of the request and on the authority behind it. Which means that somewhere in the process, someone presented a case that was convincing enough to override any hesitation, convincing enough to move forward without any contest. So again, the ultimate question shifts. What did that case look like? What specific evidence supported it? What legal arguments were made? What level of urgency justified accessing the communications of elected officials? And why is none of that visible to the public? Because if the justification is legitimate, if the process was followed correctly, and if the oversight mechanisms functioned as intended, then transparency would not weaken the system, it would significantly strengthen it. And yet transparency remains extremely limited, so we arrive at the central critical tension. A system that asks for trust, a public that asks for clarity, and between them a series of answers that are technically correct, procedurally sound, and substantively incomplete. And that is where this stops being merely a legal discussion and becomes something far more fundamental. Because when a system relies heavily on technical correctness to answer questions of immense public consequence, it is no longer just protecting an investigation, it is protecting itself. Not necessarily through wrongdoing, not necessarily through conspiracy, but through control. Control over what is said, control over what is confirmed, and control over what remains just out of reach. That control over time creates a distinct pattern that the public can feel even when it cannot fully prove it. Let us bring everything back together, not as separate threads, but as one single continuous line of logic. A high-ranking official, Howard Lutnick, publicly describes Jeffrey Epstein as a blackmailer operating at a scale that implies leverage over powerful individuals. The Attorney General, Pam Bondi, acknowledges awareness of that statement, yet confirms no full review and no direct interview. A United States Senator, John Kennedy, introduces a detailed framework suggesting that federal investigators may have obtained phone records tied to 8 sitting senators. The Department of Justice refuses to either confirm or deny the existence of those specific records, citing standard procedural limitations. Telecommunications companies, in theory, possess the ability and in some cases the obligation to challenge such subpoenas to protect themselves from liability. There is absolutely zero confirmation that they did. Each point stands on its own. But stacked together, they do something else. They create immense pressure. Pressure on the system to explain how these pieces fit or, conversely, why they do not fit. And instead of that explanation, what we see is containment. Not dramatic, not overt, but measured, controlled answers that close doors just enough to prevent any follow-up, but not enough to resolve the burning question behind them. And that brings us to the specific moment that defines this entire hearing. It is not the loudest exchange, it is not the most emotional, it is instead the simplest one. Have you interviewed him? No. That is it. No expansion, no urgency, and no indication that a claim of that magnitude has triggered any direct investigative response. And in that simplicity, the entire weight of the issue becomes visible. Because if the system is not moving aggressively on that kind of lead, then either it already knows the definitive answer, or it is choosing not to pursue the question in any way the public can see. Those are the only 2 possibilities that actually fit the logic presented. Now step back and consider what that truly means in real terms. If Epstein's operation involved leverage, real leverage, documented, recorded, preserved, then the implications extend far beyond any one individual. They extend into networks, into relationships, and into influence. And if those implications exist, then investigating them would not be simple, it would not be contained, and it would absolutely not be comfortable. Because it would require following connections wherever they may lead, regardless of who they might touch, and that is where the true moral weight of this story lives. Not in the technicalities, not in the procedural language, but in the question of whether the system is willing to pursue the truth when that truth becomes inconvenient for the people inside it. Now bring in the people who are not in that room, the victims, the individuals whose lives were directly affected by Epstein's actions, the individuals who have spent years watching documents surface, names circulate, narratives shift, and who still feel that the full picture has not yet been revealed. For them, this is not about subpoenas or legal thresholds. It is about whether the system that failed to protect them once is now willing to fully confront what happened. And every time a lead appears to stall, every time a question is met with a boundary instead of an answer, that doubt grows stronger. Not because they are looking for a spectacle, but because they are looking for completion. Completion of the story, completion of accountability, and completion of justice. Now return to the hearing one last time. Kennedy does not accuse. He does not declare conclusions. He constructs a path that begins with a clear public statement, moves through a lack of direct follow-up, expands into questions of investigative authority, and ends at the edge of institutional accountability. And at every single step along that path, the system responds in exactly the same way, carefully, precisely, and incompletely. So the final question is not hidden, it is sitting right there in the open, unanswered. Not because it cannot be asked, but because it has not been fully addressed. Is the law being applied equally, or is it being applied within limits that the public is not allowed to see? Because if the true answer is the first, then transparency should automatically follow. And if the true answer is the second, then trust becomes conditional. A justice system built upon conditional trust is not stable, it is fragile. Fragile not because it lacks authority, but because it lacks belief. Belief from the people it serves, and belief from the individuals who depend upon it to act without fear or favor. And once that belief starts to erode, restoring it becomes much harder than maintaining it ever was. So here is where that ultimately leaves us. A hearing that began as routine and ended as something else entirely, a set of questions that exposed not just gaps in information, but gaps in public confidence. And a system that now faces a definitive choice: continue managing the narrative within the boundaries of procedure, or step beyond those boundaries and provide the clarity that this case has demanded for years, because the pressure is not going away. Every document release, every interview, and every hearing like this one adds another layer, another reason for the public to keep asking. Who knew? Who was involved? What evidence exists? And why does it still feel like pieces of this story are missing? Those questions will not disappear. They will follow every statement, every appearance, and every official response connected to this case until they are answered. Not partially, not conditionally, but fully. So now the question turns to you. Do you believe what you just watched was a system working exactly as it should, or a system revealing its limits in real time? And more importantly, how much longer should those limits be accepted without explanation? If you think this kind of breakdown matters, don't just watch it and move on. Like the video so more people see it, comment with what stood out to you. Was it the answer or the silence that followed it? Share this with someone who still thinks this case is finished, and subscribe. Because the next hearing, the next document, and the next moment like this one is coming faster than anyone is willing to admit.